Did you know John Wayne was in Star Wars? Now, I know that feels like the most random thing, not only to be true, but for me to be bringing up right now. But I promise this is all tied together. First of all, for those too young or lacking in classic film exposure education, John Wayne was the biggest name in Hollywood during the Western era from the 40s through the 60s. What Robert Downey Jr. is to Marvel, John Wayne was to cowboy movies. And there were a lot of cowboy movies made back then. Now, this is relevant to our story because John Wayne played Rooster Cogburn in the initial film adaptation of this book, which came out only a year after the novel's release. And I'd say he had a lot of fun with the role. In fact, my only kind of criticism of how he differs from Book Rooster is that he seems to have a more playfully grumpy energy in the film. Anyway, what does this have to do with Star Wars? Well, I was looking through the Wikipedia page for the 1969 movie, and I saw that Wayne won an Oscar for his role as Rooster. I then went to John Wayne's personal wiki because I knew this was towards the end of his career, and I was curious how many other movies he made after True Grit, which I guess I also should mention, this was the only Oscar he won in his illustrious career. So crazy that he could make that many movies and win one kind of on the way out. But in terms of how many movies he made after True Grit, the answer is not many. But that was when I saw a line that I was very surprised by. It claimed he had been in Star Wars. One of the last things he ever did, in fact. And if you're thinking, I have never seen him in Star Wars, you would be right. Because it turns out it's an uncredited appearance. Because he didn't even know about it. He is allegedly the voice of Garandan in New Hope. Garandan is the alien that looks kind of like a plague doctor in Tatooine who rats on Luke and Obi-Wan to the Imperials. Here's the audio clip of what his voice sounds like. Now, the sound designer responsible for creating alien voices in the film has since admitted that because they wanted the aliens to feel foreign but still have some element of human to them, he would often start with actual clips of recorded dialogue and then distort them into alien language. And Garandan happens to have originated from a dialogue clip from a John Wayne movie. So it's useless to know this, and yet it is very interesting information to help us get going today. And without further ado, let's dive back into Charles Portis's Western epic, True Grit. Okay, so a quick recap to dive back in. Rooster, LaBeef, and Mattie are on the trail of Ned Pepper's gang, where they expect to find Tom Chaney, aka Theron Chelmsford. They have just captured two men who are now both dead, but that revealed enough info that they have been waiting in their little dugout cabin for Pepper's gang to come grab fresh horses after they would supposedly have robbed a train. We enter the scene with our intrepid adventurers preparing for the arrival of Lucky Ned Pepper on the snow-dusted grounds of eastern Oklahoma. Rooster had just ordered LaBeef to saddle the horses, which felt like him saying they were leaving, and yet Rooster didn't act like he was going anywhere. He told Mattie to straighten up the interior of the dugout as much as he could so that it didn't look like a struggle for life had happened here. Rooster dragged the corpses out, and Mattie covered the trails of blood with dust on the floorboards. They built the fire back up so that even with the door closed, it would look like the cabin was occupied. And then the real plan was set in motion. LaBeef was sent up to an overlooking hill with strict orders to not fire unless Rooster shot first. He would be in the woods adjacent to the dugout. His plan was to let the men enter the cabin, only killing the final one on his way in, so that by the time they realized there was an ambush, the survivors would already be trapped inside. "You will shoot him in the back?" the ranger asked, as if this was dishonorable. "It will give them the time to know that our intentions are serious. These aren't chicken thieves. After we kill the first one, I'll call out to them, giving them a chance to come out and be taken alive." LaBeef felt like this plan was only going to lead to everyone being killed, including his precious bounty Chelmsford. "Well, we don't know how many of them there is," Rooster said. "We do know that there's only two of us, so we have to play to our advantages." The ranger asked if he could try to just wing Chelmsford, but Rooster said that sharp rifle of his isn't capable of winging anybody. If you hit someone with it, you're killing them. So LaBeef should try to take out Pepper, and Rooster agrees to try to wing Chaney with his Winchester. This plan is agreeable to LaBeef, and Mattie was given no role in this plan, but it felt natural that she would stick around with Rooster in the woods. In the cold winter night air, there was silence for what felt like ages. Mattie fed the horses from a safe distance into the woods, and Rooster initially told her to stay there, that he didn't want her close to the fighting, but she was not about to stay alone in the woods at night, and he relented. But The one thing he stood firm on was she was not to bring her revolver. He didn't want her having any illusions of getting involved in the gunfight. Rooster clutched his rifle and laid his pistols out in front of him from his hiding place for quick access. He tried to hand her some corn dodgers to munch on, but she turned them down after he refused to light a match for her because she knew some of them had gotten blood on them and was not about to eat those ones. In the long, quiet night, Mattie asked Rooster about his past, and we learned quite a bit in this rare moment where he's not drinking to kill time. The initial question was just what did he do before he was a marshal? And his answer is that he skinned buffalo and wolves as big as Mattie in Texas. He said it paid well, but he didn't like the wind and the open country. He says he's been out west as far as Colorado, freighting supplies. She then asks if he'd fought in the war. "Yeah, I did," he said. "Is that where you lost your eye?" He nodded. "It was in the Battle of Lone Jack out in Kansas City. My horse was drowned, but Cole Younger crawled out in a hall of fire to bring me back. Poor Cole, he and Bob and Jim are now all doing life in Minnesota." "Did you know Jesse James?" she asked. He says that he doesn't remember him, but Potter, his friend and colleague that he has obviously mourned losing in that Wharton shootout, told him once that James had fought with them at Centralia and killed a Yankee major there. Potter said James was a mean little viper and Frank was there too, but they just called him Buck. And if you have a sense of those names, you can see the rich history that the author Portis drew from for his characters. And if you don't, this story just ID'd that our man, Marshall Cogburn, fought alongside and knew the most famous outlaw gang in post-Civil War America. Jesse James is probably the most famous name. He had a brother, Frank James, and the two of them formed a gang with the younger brothers, Cole, Jim, and Bob. For 10 years after the war, they robbed banks, stagecoaches, trains. They became famous, almost celebrity status for the refined folks back east in civilization to read about in the papers. They were rebel heroes, Southern Avengers, all sorts of labels were given to them, but they were also very violent at times, and they were finally stopped in 1876 when they tried to rob a bank in Minnesota. But the townsfolk actually fought back. The James brothers escaped, but the younger brothers were all captured. The James brothers continued robbing for another 6 years until Jesse was killed by a gang member who wanted to cash in on his reward. I'd say Jesse James is a top 3 Western outlaw of all time in terms of fame, and he's probably not 2 or 3 on that list. Billy the Kid and Butch Cassidy are the only names who probably are as well known as his. So for Rooster to reveal that he not only knew these men but fought alongside them adds a layer of depth to his character that we just would not have predicted otherwise. And it allows for the author to show off his ability to weave fiction into history. The conversation shifts to after the war, and he says that he and Potter, who we quickly put together was the closest thing Rooster ever had to a best friend, had turned in their weapons to the government at the end of the war like so many soldiers were required to do, but they were told to report back the next morning, and they didn't like the sound of that. So they smuggled a pistol and a couple mules and set out during the night to find their own adventure. They had no money between them, but they found a few Union soldiers along the way. One of them was a paymaster, so they relieved those men of their purses, which had about $4,000 in it. And this was how Potter and Cogburn started their new lives. Mattie is critical of him thieving, but the way he sees it, he was stealing from the government, which isn't like robbing folks at all. Potter went to Arkansas, but Rooster went to Illinois and opened a restaurant called the Green Frog. He married a widow and tried to settle down, but the wife wanted him to become more learned, like a businessman, and that just wasn't in the cards for him. So she eventually left him to run the joint alone, and they had one son together, but Rooster said the boy never liked him anyway, so he went with his mama. Eventually, he sold the restaurant because he didn't know what to do by himself. He never even learned how to buy meat from suppliers. Quote, "I didn't know what I was doing. I was like a man fighting bees." That visual gets the point across pretty accurately, doesn't it? He then headed to New Mexico, where he admittedly became more of a career thief himself. But again, he never robbed citizens, only institutions and government entities. He says he did that until he was notorious enough for a posse to form, and he tells a tale that Mattie finds hard to believe. "I had to fly for my life, 3 fights in one day. Bo was a strong colt then, and there was not a horse in that territory could run him in the ground, but I did not appreciate being chased and shot at like a thief. When the posse had thinned down to about 7 men, I turned Bo around and taking the reins in my teeth and rode right at them boys, firing them 2 Navy 6s I carry on my saddle. I guess they was all married men who loved their families as they scattered and run for home." Mattie says that's hard to believe. One man riding at 7, he claims it's true that they used to do this in the war. You go for a man hard enough and fast enough and he don't have time to think about how many is with him. He thinks about himself and how he may get clear out of the wrath that is about to set down on him. And it was after that he took up his gig as a buffalo skinner before he eventually ended up being a marshal. And all of this backstory tells me one very unique thing about this character. He has been on both sides of the law and feels morally fine with either side, which suggests he cares more about the lifestyle he can live than which side of the law he is on. Can he roam around on his horse hunting for something like a treasure or a quest, beast or man? Well, apparently, as long as he gets paid to do that, the actual job description is less important. Mattie eventually got sleepy and dozed off as Rooster became the chattiest that he'd ever been with her. He talked all night, it seemed, but she had eventually fallen asleep when he shook her, saying the bandits were arriving. Mattie popped her head up just enough to look at the moonlit scene. There were 6 men. They had assumed 4 max based on the horse count hiding in the cave, but no, there were 6. Suddenly, Rooster's plan to shoot someone in the back while boxing the others in felt like the right move. She said she couldn't see their faces and didn't know if Cheney was with them. "Well, you can tell which one is Pepper," Rooster whispered. "He's the little one without a hat." The men seemed pretty casual. There was distant laughter, but they also took their time getting off their horses because one of them made a sound like a turkey gobble and the others sat silently, as if waiting for a reply. The man repeated the call, but there was nothing. Oh no, had there been some sign that Quincy was supposed to give? 2 men dismounted. One of the remaining riders was calling Quincy's name. The marshal whispered, "That one is Hayes." 2 men went inside the cabin, coming back out as Hayes continued to holler for Quincy. They could hear the men discussing how there was a pot of soft-key cooking, but no sign of the men. Most of the men seemed content to not worry about where they were since they had left food and horses behind. But Ned Pepper wasn't just lucky. He was smart, and he knew something was off. One of the men tried to convince Ned to just let them eat and hurry off on the horses. This one Cogburn identified as the Mexican known as the original Greaser Bob, or as I like to call him, OG Bob. Ned didn't even respond to that request. He just sat, leaned over the pommel of his saddle, considering matters. Suddenly, he sat up straight, pulled his pistol, and fired 3 shots into the air. The echo rumbled through the canyon, and it had almost died back to silence when a shot tore through the valley, taking Ned Pepper's horse down. The entire group of outlaws responded in a panic. Rooster swore and stood as he started firing his repeater at the men. He killed Hayes instantly with 1 shot. He landed another on OG Bob, but the Mexican got away on his horse. The hot cartridges fell out of his gun as he kept pumping. One landed on Mattie's hand, burning her. But otherwise, she notes that she was so mesmerized by the scene that she could have been no help had she tried. Everything happened so fast. So while Rooster was shooting Hayes and OG, Ned Pepper had slid to the side of his dead horse so he was protected from the direction where the shot had come. He used his knife to cut his saddle wallets free, and the remaining 3 had initially taken off, firing blindly in LaBeef's general direction, but Pepper hollered at them, running towards them in a zigzag pattern that may have looked silly, but it did make it impossible for Rooster to land a shot. Lucky was a truly deserved title. One of his men heard his yells and wheeled back to pick up the boss. He leaned over to let Pepper grab his arm so he could pull him up onto the horse, but just as he reached out, Rooster landed a shot that dropped the man from his horse. Ned Pepper quickly and with no hesitation jumped on the now vacant horse and rode off. 2 dead, 4 escaped, one of those wounded. The marshal and Mattie went out to examine the bodies while LaBeef came down from off the hill. Neither of the corpses were Cheney. When LaBeef got down, Rooster started cursing him out for firing prematurely, not willing to acknowledge that his plan of wait until I fire was kind of oversimplified when it's nighttime and it's hard to see. The 2 men fought with words, and Mattie is sure it would have come to blows if LaBeef was not nursing an injury. A ball had struck his rifle stock, and splinters of wood and lead had torn through his upper arm. He shares that he fired because he was repositioning during the moment when Pepper shot his pistol. He had not had a good angle, but since he was moving, he didn't see who had fired the shots and decided better safe than sorry when it came to being their overwatch. Rooster just called it a likely story and that he thinks the ranger had actually fallen asleep and was startled by the sound of gunfire. They tended to LaBeef's wounds, found the dead man Hayes' horse, who had sacks containing dozens of watches, ladies' rings, pistols, and about $600 cash. So they had robbed the Katy Flyer. Narrator Mattie then gives us a historical account of the robbery from what she found later, which basically just confirms that these men were efficient at robbing trains. They packed up the gear as well as the 4 dead bodies, because remember, it's not just the 2 from that last shootout, but Moon and Quincy, putting them on the spare horses, and they headed to McAllister's. LaBeef started whistling to keep his mind off of his painful arm, And when Rooster muttered something about hating a man who whistles, the ranger just started whistling louder. The ride was long enough that LaBeef started asking about Rooster's time in the war, saying he himself had wanted to join up at the beginning, but his ma wouldn't let him because he was too young. His brothers had been gone for 3 years by the time he enlisted. He was only in the service for the last 6 months of the war, but that was time that he was proud to have served. Rooster didn't respond, and when the ranger had asked about when and where Rooster served, Cogburn played dumb, saying he didn't remember the division he was in. He just knew he was on a horse. You don't even remember your regiment? LaBeef asked. I think they called it the Bullet Department. I was in it for 4 years. You don't think much of me, do you, Cogburn? I don't think about you at all when your mouth is closed. That one has to go on the burn list. It's funny to pay attention to how many of these excellent burns are directed at LaBeef. This man is constantly the target of people trying to humble him. I was told at Fort Smith you rode with Quantrill and that border gang. Now, we have heard that name in the first half of the story, and I told you I'd explain it later. Rooster did not respond. I heard they were not soldiers, but murdering thieves. I've heard the same thing, Rooster said sullenly. I heard they murdered women and children at Lawrence. I heard that too. It was a damned lie. Were you there? Where? The Lawrence raid. There's been a lot of lies told about that. So you deny that you shot soldiers and civilians alike before burning the town down? Rooster tried to turn it back on LaBeef, asking defensively what side of the war the younger man had fought on, but the ranger proudly states he was in the Army of Northern Virginia, and he doesn't have to hang his head when he says it. I don't like the way you make conversation, Cogburn. The marshal said that was nothing for him to worry about. That or Captain Quantrill. Captain Quantrill? Let it go, LaBeef. Captain of what? Let this alone if you don't want to fight. LaBeef was still amazed that he just heard Rooster call one of the more notorious figures of the Southern Army Captain Quantrill. At this point of the story, it transitions to them arriving in McAllister's store, so I'll now give a mini history lesson so you understand the subtext of that last exchange. William Quantrill was a guerrilla leader of a group of Confederates that operated in Missouri and Kansas during the war. Now, I say guerrilla because these men did not stand in rows firing rifles across the field. They specialized in raids and ambushes. His men became known as the Quantrill Raiders. Now, groups like this often get tagged as being less honorable because of their sneaky nature, ambushing men and supply trains instead of engaging in open battle. But Quantrill was different. Keep in mind, the James brothers and some of the younger brothers were part of his raiders. It's as if their work for the Confederate Army as guerrilla soldiers refined their train robbing skills for their post-war lives. But the real kicker is what's known as the Lawrence Raid. Quantrill led 400 men into a city known for its anti-slavery position, and they proceeded to kill not only soldiers, but they dragged men and boys out of their homes, executing them, doing other unspeakable things, before eventually burning the town to the ground. Now, this is the picture we get from the book, although not in as much detail, and this is the story according to people who sympathize with the North. But one thing that I learned as a teenager that shocked me at the time was learning that people in the South do not tell the same stories about the Civil War as I learned in history class. Now, I grew up in a state that didn't even exist during the war, but I learned the classic pro-Northern version, and I was literally speechless when I was talking to a friend I'd made from a southern state, and we got into an argument about some of the facts of the Civil War. It had never occurred to me that people from the South to this day defended that they were in the right. And I can almost hear any listeners I have from southern states yelling at their speaker right now, we were. But I say this now with a wide open understanding that people from different backgrounds will always see things differently from you. And their truth is as sacred and correct to them as your truth is to you. But that moment is burned in my brain as the one that first made me realize it. So when it comes to the Quantrill Raid, you can easily find support from Southern historians that it was not a massacre, but a precise mission to eliminate the Union forces in the town and try to specifically target Jim Lane, a Union officer who had been a terror to Confederate forces and civilians in the region. So there is a firsthand account that I found from one of his raiders who, talk about narrative bias, claims there were orders by Quantrill not to kill civilians, only soldiers, and that they did not find Lane in the town, but ransacked his home in search for him anyway. Admittedly, this account says there were a few civilian casualties. The pro-Quantrill argument also says that his raid was only done in the first place because of the wrongs that had been done to Southerners at the hand of Jim Lane and his men. In fact, I didn't include this in the account between LaBeef and Rooster, But when LaBeef is asking about all the women and children that were killed, Rooster's only response was, "We missed Jim Lane." But the pro-Confederate POV is that these men were only pushing back against the horrible acts of the Northern Army. And obviously, the pro-Union side sees it as a massacre of innocents. Meanwhile, one account from the anti-Quantrill version paints him as a cold-blooded warlord. One man was shot 5 times when he tried to surrender, and that he was left for dead by his assailant with the parting advice, quote, "Tell old God that the last man you saw on earth was Quantrill." So, I'm not here to take a stance and say 100% what happened because I wasn't there and I have not reviewed the evidence, and even the historical evidence is subjected to human bias on all sides. I obviously do know that if I was taught about the Lawrence raid in high school, I definitely heard the Union point of view about it. All I will say are these 2 statements. 1, men are capable of doing very ugly things in war when they feel justified. And 2, the history we are taught in whatever part of the world we come from is far from being purely objective. So I took all that time to share this history, not only because it adds even more depth and mystery to who Rooster Cogburn is, but it's an example of how truth means very different things to different people depending on the story that they have been told. Once I get to McAllister, Rooster connects with an old friend of sorts. His name's Captain Finch, a Native American who serves as the law in these territories. He technically has more authority than either the ranger or the marshal here. I'm going to skip over the details of this visit since I just spent minutes describing a historical event that's not even a big part of this story itself. But Rooster and Captain Finch talk about what is known as the Pepper Gang. Rooster confirms the men they'd killed in their skirmishes, and he hands over the stolen goods that they had recouped. They both agree that they know where Ned has likely gone, an old hideout that properly fortified them from attackers. Mattie was confused at how Rooster was eager to profit off the possessions of the dead men, which she saw as wrong, but how he was so faithful about not taking one red penny from the loot they'd recovered from the train robbery. Cogburn was such a mystery to her. They stayed at McAllister's just long enough to eat, get some sleep, and dress LaBeef's wound and fix his rifle up. Surprising to Mattie, Rooster made one more attempt to leave her in the safety of the McAllisters, saying the time has come now that he must ride fast and the danger will only increase. She should wait here and he will be back in a day or 2 with her man. Even more surprising to Mattie was LaBeef was the one who was defending her, saying that she has won her spurs and he feels she has the right to ride with them if she chooses. So eventually, as you can assume, she gets to go with them. They had been on the trail for 40 minutes when Captain Finch came riding up excitedly to notify them that he had just gotten word that Otis Wharton, remember he was the man who got convicted in the first part of the story from the trial that Rooster was testifying in? Anyway, Otis Wharton had broken out of jail with some help from accomplices, and he was still at large. Rooster did not seem angry or frightened at the news. If anything, he was amused. Mattie reflects that her best guess is because this act would spoil all those efforts of his lawyer, Gowdy, to get his sentence commuted, but that the lawyer would be out a lot of money in the wasted process of trying to help that man. As they rode toward Ned Pepper's hideout, Rooster drank more and more. They were used to him drinking enough to take the edge off at any given time, but this was different. Mattie says it didn't slow him down any, but he did start acting silly. They pushed hard across the open plains, climbing limestone hills. The open air felt good, but the hours and hours on horseback did not agree with Mattie. Quote, "I never claimed to be a cowboy," she notes in this part. It was a hard ride, and Pepper's hideout was, after all, hidden, but not just in terms of obscurity, in terms of how far removed it was from civilization. Rooster became so drunk that he started disclosing more information about himself. It was as if his drunken self was answering the hard-hitting questions from LaBeef earlier about the war. "Well, we done the best we could with what we had. All we had was revolvers and horses." He spoke loudly, but he slurred his words, and at one point he even fell off his horse. But he was quick to get back in the saddle, saying that it was nothing. Bo just put his foot wrong. He spilled more details about his personal history that really serves the reader to just understand that Rooster does feel the conflict between who he portrays himself to be, this maverick who does whatever he feels is right, and the more traditional moral sense of who he may have been taught to be when he was younger. Some of this drunken talking complained about women and how they only took and never gave. Mattie was about to argue with the man, but, quote, "I had not the strength nor the inclination to bandy words with a drunkard." And here's my favorite part. "What have you done when you've bested a fool?" I think of all the fights I see on social media where it's clearly two people who have nothing better to do than argue with strangers. And I think about that line because one, when you fight with a stranger online, no one will ever admit they were actually wrong to start. And two, even if you did get them to finally admit they were wrong, what have you achieved? You just wasted hours of your life arguing with someone that had so little to do that they instigated a fight online. Congratulations, I guess. Eventually, they had traveled 50 miles before they got close enough to their destination that Rooster said they should stop for the night. He reckons they are about 4 miles away from Pepper's hideout, and LaBeef had to see to the horses since Cogburn was out of sorts. They made no fire that night. The sky was clear enough that Mattie identifies the Big Dipper through the tree branches. Her back hurt, her feet were swollen, but her time on the trail had conditioned her body to sleep when she could. The pain that used to keep her awake now quickly faded into slumber. The next morning, Rooster was up before the sun like he always was, a little worse for wear this time, but at least he was sober. Mattie woke up feeling like she had just closed her eyes, and she was sent to fetch water from the stream down below the camp by 100 yards or so. She yawned as she carried the canvas bucket down to fill it. Quote, as I neared the bottom, dreading the return climb, I heard splashing and blowing noises. My thought was, what on earth? Then I came into the open on a creek bank. On the other side, there was a man watering some horses. The man was none other than Tom Chaney. You may readily imagine that I registered shock at the sight of the squat assassin. He had not yet seen me, nor heard me either because of the noises made by his horses. His rifle was slung across his back on the cotton plow line. I thought to turn and run, but I could not move. I stood there, fixed. Then he saw me. He gave a start and brought the rifle quickly into play. He held the rifle on me and peered across the little stream and studied me. Well, now I know you. You're little Mattie the bookkeeper. He put the rifle back on his shoulder, assuming this girl was not a threat to him. What are you doing here? He asked. I came to fetch water. No, what are you doing up here in these mountains? She reached into her bucket and pulled out the dragoon pistol, aiming it at her father's murderer, and said, I'm here to take you back to Fort Smith. Chaney laughed, saying he would not go with her, and she said there was a posse of officers on the hill that would force him to go. Well, that is interesting news, the man said. How many is up there? Right around 50, the young woman said, pistol still fixed on him. She told him to leave the horses that he had with him and come with her. He told her he thinks he's going to have to leave it to those 50 marshals to come get him. If you refuse to go, I will have to shoot you. Oh, he said. Then you better cock your piece. Mattie fumbled with the hammer all the way back till it locks, he said, coaching her. I know how to do it. Real quick side note, this scene of the intended gun victim coaching the would-be shooter gave me very strong Svidrigailov and Dunya vibes from Crime and Punishment, but the difference is when Chaney once more refused to go with her, she pulled the trigger and buried a bullet in his ribcage. It knocked him over as he clutched his side. Rooster and LaBeef called out to her. She yelled that she was okay, but she heard other voices in the distance behind Chaney. I didn't think you would do it, he cried out. You broken one of my ribs. I can't breathe without pain. You killed my father when he was trying to help you, Mattie yelled, blinking back her tears. Chaney winced before saying more calmly, I regret shooting Mr. Ross. He was decent to me. But he ought not to have meddled in my business. I was mad and drunk. Nothing has gone right for me. She heard voices yelling from the hills, getting closer. Mattie kept her gun fixed on Chaney. You're just a piece of trash. They say you killed a senator in Texas. That man threatened my life, Chaney shouted. Everything is against me. Get on your feet and get over here before I shoot you again. You'll have to help me up. I will not. Get up yourself. He darted for a chunk of wood, and Mattie pulled the trigger, but the cartridge did not fire. She tried again, but the hammer still did not trigger a combustion. She tried a third time, but before she could pull the trigger, Chaney had flung the chunk of wood at her, knocking her in the chest. He splashed through the shallow water to her, grabbing her by the coat and slapping her, cursing her father's name. That was his cur nature, narrator Mattie says. He put her revolver in his belt and started dragging her in the direction of the unknown voices behind him. She heard Rooster and LaBeef crashing through the brush towards her and called out to them, which earned her more slaps from Chaney. Men came from both directions, but Chaney's men won the foot race. Ned Pepper was there with several men, including original Greaser Bob. Ned rode up to them, yelling at Chaney, but he quickly grabbed Mattie by the arm, demanding to know who was out there. Cogburn and 50 more officers, she said. He, quote, shook her like a terrier shaking a rat and said, Tell me another lie and I will stove your head in. She was close enough that she could see the tear in his lip and the missing teeth from where Cogburn's bullet had landed, but failed to kill lucky Ned Pepper. He still spoke clearly enough for her to take his threat seriously. She then admitted to it only being 2 men. Pepper threw her to the ground, putting one boot on her neck before yelling, "Rooster, can you hear me?" There was no answer. "Answer me, Rooster, or I will kill this girl, you know I will." The rooster called up from downstream. "The girl's nothing to me. She's a runaway from Arkansas. You saying I should kill her?" "Do what you think is best, Ned," came the answer. "I'd think it over first, though." "I've already thought it over," the bandit leader said. "You and Potter," obviously these men have enough history that when he's told it's Rooster and one other man, he just assumes it would have been his longtime friend Potter. But Ned didn't know that Potter has already been killed. Anyway, he orders the 2 of them to ride over the bald, meaning not covered by trees, ridge to the northwest. If they comply, he will spare the girl. They have 5 minutes. "We'll need more time than that, Ned." "I will not give you more than that," Ned said. "There's a party of marshals on their way here, Ned. Give me the girl and Cheney, and I will mislead them for 6 hours so you can get away." "You think I'd buy that, Rooster?" "I will cover you till dark," Cogburn said. "Your 5 minutes is already running," Pepper shouted. He looked down at Mattie, who was squirming but not necessarily trying to make an effort to escape. "Your life depends on their actions. I've never busted a cap on a woman or anybody younger than 16, but I will do what I have to do." They brought her back to their camp, and she took in the other bandits. There was Cheney, OG Bob, and 2 men who she found out later are brothers, the Permalee brothers. Something seemed off about them. They made animal noises a lot when they got excited. Their camp was just a few dozen meters from the ridgeline with a good scouting view of the valley below. One of the Permalee brothers patched Cheney up as he complained that nothing ever goes right for him. Once he was bandaged, he looked at Mattie, snarled, and threatened to wring her scrawny neck. But Ned Pepper shoved the man and told him to saddle the horses. Pepper then pushed Mattie down so she was seated by the fire, telling her to be still. He stood at the edge of the rock shelf that their camp sat on, pulled out his spyglass, and observed the valley. Mattie asked if she could have some of the bacon she saw in the skillet. He told her to help herself before asking her to explain what she was doing here. Mattie was happy to do so, assuming he would see that she was in the right for coming after Cheney. So she explained about her father and the money that Cheney stole and how she hired Rooster Cogburn as the man who had grit. She talked about how she had found Cheney at the river and shot him but then misfired twice. And Pepper laughed, saying, "They will do it. Guns will embarrass you every time when you actually need them. Most girls like pretty things, but you like guns, don't you?" "I don't care a thing about guns," she snapped. "If I did, I'd have one that worked." Cheney interrupted, claiming that he had not been shot by the girl, but that he had been ambushed by the marshal. Mattie yells at him for telling such a lie, but he points to the opening of a pit near the edge of camp that he claims contains rattlesnakes and tells her that he will throw her in. Pepper told both of them to shut up. He was still watching the valley, in particular the bald ridgeline he'd told Cogburn to exit through. He asked her if it was Rooster and Potter that had ambushed them the night before. "His name's not Potter, it's LeBeef. He's a Texas Ranger. He's also looking for Cheney." "So he's the one with the buffalo gun?" Pepper asked. "He calls it a Sharp's rifle." "Did they take Quincy and Moon?" "Both of them are dead." "And Hayes too?" "Yes." "I already knew Billy was killed the moment he was struck," Pepper said about the man who had been killed trying to rescue him. "He was tough as boot leather. I am sorry for him." "You don't seem that sorry for the death of a man who saved your life." "I'm happy he done it, but he shouldn't have. He was too green to know that he should have just gotten out while he could." One of the Permalee brothers started whooping excitedly, saying, "There they be!" Pepper fixed his glass on the hillside. Even Mattie could make out 2 figures on horses, her little Blackie trailing behind as they reached the peak of the barren hilltop. Rooster pulled his pistol and fired it into the air. Ned Pepper pulled his and returned fire to acknowledge. Then the men descended on the far side of the hill. Watching them vanish was the first time Mattie really became aware of her situation. She didn't think the lawmen would actually comply so easily. She blamed Rooster. He was the one so drunk before that they made camp a mile away instead of 4 miles away. It was also while drunk that he had made the cartridges for her pistol while back in Fort Smith, which had misfired. And now he had abandoned her to these criminals. "Is that what they called grit in Fort Smith?" she thought. "We call that something else in Yell County." Pepper told his men to saddle up, and Cheney made ready to go with them. But Pepper had other plans. He claimed they didn't have enough fresh mounts if it came to a race out there, so Cheney was tasked with staying behind with the girl for now. The gang leader promised he would send men back with fresh horses and they could meet up at the old place that night. Cheney doesn't like this at all, saying the marshals will be up in these hills soon. Mattie also protested, saying she will not be left alone with Cheney. Everyone had heard him threaten her life. "He'll do no such thing," Pepper said calmly. "If he wants his cut, he will not lay a hand on you. You hear that, Tom? If you hurt this child, you will not get paid." Cheney was begging the other bandits to let him ride with them, but nobody was about to challenge the boss's orders. After mounting up, Pepper rode to Cheney to reassure him. "I'll have your winnings at the old place. We'll see you there tonight." They rode off, and Mattie Ross found herself alone, 100 miles away from the nearest town, with her father's murderer. Cheney sat across the fire from Mattie, just staring at her as she heated some water. "What are you doing?" he asked. "I want to wash the black off my hands." "A little smut will not harm you." "That is true, or else you and your friends would surely have died already." "I would still rather have it off." "Don't provoke me, or I'll throw you in the pit." "You heard Ned Pepper. You harm me and you will not get paid." "I think he doesn't mean to pay me anyway. I don't think he'll really send anyone back for me." "At least you have not been abandoned by a man you paid to serve and protect you." "You hush. What do you know about hardship? Now keep still while I think." She sat there for a moment but couldn't keep to herself for very long. "What have you done with Papa's mare?" He didn't respond. "If you let me go, I swear to keep silent about you for 2 days." "I can do better than that," Cheney grumbled. "I can have your silence forever. Now I will not tell you again." The water on the fire was not yet boiling, but steam was rising off of it, so Mattie picked up the can with a rag and flung it at Tom Cheney before running as fast as she could. If she could make it to the tree line, she believed she could hide from him, but it wasn't meant to be. She had not made it far when she felt a hand grab her coat and yank her back. Cheney's face was still dripping and bright red from the hot water. He was swearing at her as he conked her on the head with the barrel of his pistol. The pain was so sharp, she imagined she'd been shot at first because she didn't know how to process that much pain. Her mind raced with what she was sure would be her final thoughts. Her home in Arkansas, her siblings, her mama. First, that woman's husband and now her oldest child, both gone to the same bloody hand. But before Cheney could do anything more than smack her around a little bit, she heard a familiar voice. "Hands up, Chelmsford. What happens next is all up to you. Careful with that pistol." It was LaBeef. He had snuck back around on foot, it seemed, based on how out of breath he was, but his rifle was fixed on Cheney. "Aw, everything is against me," Cheney grumbled as he dropped his pistol to the ground and let go of Mattie. "You hurt, Mattie?" LaBeef asked. "I got a knot in my head," she said, wincing. "I see you're bleeding." "Where's Rooster?" she asked. "He's down below, watching the front door. Let's find a place where we can watch." They skirted around the rock shelf, glancing down into the dark pit that Cheney had said contained rattlers. Quote, "No sooner had we taken up our vigil than we were rewarded with the sight of Lucky Ned Pepper and the other 3 bandits emerging from the trees into the meadow. They mounted their horses and headed them west, away from us. They had hardly started their ride when a lone horseman came out of the brush at the western end of the field. The horse was walking, and the rider took him out to the middle of the open space and stopped so as to block the passage of the 4 desperados. Yes, it was Rooster Cogburn. The bandits checked up and faced him from some 70 or 80 yards distance. Rooster had one of the Navy revolvers in his left hand, and he held the reins in his right. He said, "Where's the girl, Ned?" Lucky Ned Pepper said, "She was in wonderful health when I last saw her. I cannot answer for her now." "You will have to answer for her now," said Rooster. "Where is she?" LaBeef stood up and cupped his hands, shouting down, "She's all right, Cogburn. I have Chelmsford as well." I confirmed the news by shouting, "I'm fine, Rooster. We have Cheney. You must get away." The bandits turned to look up at us, and no doubt they were surprised and not a little disconcerted by the interesting development. Rooster made no reply to us and gave no sign of leaving the place. Lucky Ned Pepper said, "Well, Rooster, will you give us the road? We have business elsewhere." Rooster, talking to the Permley brothers, said, "Harold, I want you and your brother to stand clear. I have no interest in you today. Stand clear now, and you will not be hurt." Harold Permley's answer was to crow like a rooster, and the cock-a-doodle-doo brought a hearty laugh from his brother Farrell. Lucky Ned Pepper said, "What is your intention? Do you think 1 on 4 is a dogfall?" Brewster said, "I mean to kill you in 1 minute, Ned, or see you hanged in Fort Smith at Judge Parker's convenience. Which will you have?" Lucky Ned Pepper laughed and said, "I call that a bold talk for a one-eyed fat man." Brewster replied, "Fill your hand, you son of a bitch," and he took the reins in his teeth, pulled the other saddle revolver, and drove his spurs into the flanks of his strong horse bow, charging directly at the bandits. It was a sight to see. He held the revolvers wide on either side of the head of his plunging steed. The 4 bandits accepted the challenge, and they likewise pulled their arms and charged their ponies ahead. It was some daring move on the part of the deputy marshal whose manliness and grit I had doubted. No grit? Rooster Cogburn? Not much. LaBeef instinctively brought his rifle up, but when he relaxed it and did not fire, I pulled at his coat saying, "Shoot them!" The Texan said, "They are too far and are moving too fast." I believe the bandits began firing their weapons first, although the din and smoke was such a sudden, general nature that I cannot be sure. I do know that the marshal rode for them in so determined and unwavering a course that the bandits broke their line as he reached them and raced through them, his revolvers blazing, and he not aiming with the sights, but only pointing the barrels and snapping his head from side to side to bring his good eye into play. Harold Permally was the first to go down. He flung his shotgun in the air and clutched at his neck and was thrown backward over the rump of his horse. The original Greaser Bob rode wider than the others, and he lay flat on his horse and escaped clear with his winnings. Farrell Plumley was hit, and a moment later his horse went down with a broken leg, and Farrell was dashed violently forward to his death. We thought that Rooster had come through the ordeal with no injury, but in fact he had caught several shotgun pellets in his face and shoulders, and his horse bow was mortally struck. When Rooster attempted to rein up with his teeth and turned to resume the attack, the big horse fell to the side and Rooster underneath him. The field now remained to one rider, and that was Lucky Ned Pepper. He wheeled his horse about, his left arm hung limp and useless, but he yet held a revolver in his right hand. He said, "Well, Rooster, I am shot to pieces." Rooster had lost his big revolvers in the fall and was struggling to pull his belt gun, which was trapped to the ground under the weight of the horse and rider. Lucky Ned Pepper nudged his pony forward in a trot, and he bore down on the helpless officer. LaBeef quickly stirred beside me and assumed a sitting position with the Sharp's rifle, his elbows locked against his knee. He took only a second to draw a bead and fire the powerful gun. The ball flew to its mark like a marten to its gourd, and Lucky Ned Pepper fell dead in the saddle. The horse reared, and the body of the bandit was thrown clear, and the horse fled in panic. The distance covered by LaBeef's wonderful shot at the moving rider was over 600 yards. I am prepared to swear an affidavit to it. "Hurrah!" I joyfully exclaimed. "Hurrah for the man from Texas! Some bully shot!" LaBeef was pleased with himself, and he reloaded his rifle. But now the prisoner has an advantage over his keeper in one respect. The prisoner is always thinking of escaping, where the keeper is not constantly thinking about having to contain the prisoner. Which is to say, when Mattie and LaBeef were so consumed with the gunfight below, Cheney had quickly collected a rock the size of a small pumpkin and now brought it down on the ranger's head. LaBeef crumpled to the ground. Mattie had no idea if he was dead or not, but she quickly fixed her pistol on Cheney once more. She could only pray the gun did not misfire this time. He stalked towards her, and she fired. The ball hit Cheney somewhere in his head, and he fell to the ground. But even then, the troubles were not over. The kick from the pistol sent Mattie stumbling backwards, tripping over the rock shelf, and sprawling out behind her, falling into the pit Cheney had threatened to throw her in. She bounced and tumbled off the craggly walls of the pit, and when she came to a halt some 40 feet down, the wind was knocked out of her and her arm was broken. She wasn't on solid ground even now. She was simply wedged in a smaller crevice of a cavern that her legs had fallen into. She had no concept of how large or deep the cavern below her was. She was like a cork in a bottle. Her left arm was broken. Her right arm was pinned down to her side. Every time she moved her left arm, it was like pins and needles of pain, but she could still curl her fingers. It was completely dark except for a sliver of sun at the opening of the pit. Bits of rock and dirt were still trailing down the walls of the hole behind her. As her eyes adjusted, she could see some trash around her, bits of paper, an old tobacco sack, and just on the edge before it grew too dark to see, she could see the corner of a shirt tail. She got her breath back and slowly assessed her situation. Unable to move, but the only positive was there were no signs of snakes. Below her on the larger cavern, she could hear chirps and squeaks that she couldn't quite identify. She tried to wriggle out of her pinched position, but found without arms and upper body strength, her efforts only made her sink lower, closer to the plummeting into the unknown pit below. Her jeans were bunched up so much that her shins were exposed, and she started feeling something brush up against her bare skin. Spiders, she thought at first, but then she heard more squeaks and decided she was dealing with a bat cave, and she was blocking their exit. She wasn't scared of bats on their own, but she knew some of them carried diseases, which made her even more anxious. Was LeBeef alive? What about Rooster? Had he been able to get up from under his horse? How long would she be stuck here? Would anyone ever come for her? Her best bet was to conserve her strength and simply give a yell every 5 minutes or so in hopes that someone would come looking for the source of the gunshots. Every time she called out, her own voice mocked her, echoing off the walls of the pit. Unexpectedly, without moving, she slipped further down. The rock surfaces were covered in moss. The moss initially had worked like friction against her jeans, but now the moss seemed to be tearing free of the rock wall. She no longer could play the patient game. She grasped for anything she could with her broken arm, only coming up with a stick. She slipped more, now down to the elbow of her pinned right arm. Luckily, her bony elbow almost served as a wedge, keeping her from falling further, but the pressure on it was extremely painful. But that did give her an idea. She needed to find more wedges, more items to close around the space where she could slip through. She needed that shirt that she could see the edge of. She used her broken arm to try and pull at the shirt with her stick. She broke the first stick, found a second, and with that one, she pulled the shirt just close enough to reach it with her arm. It hurt so much, but this was literally a do-or-die situation, so she sucked it up and stretched until her finger and thumb successfully pinched the edge of the shirt, and she pulled. It was much heavier than she was expecting. Something was attached to it. She pulled harder before jerking her hand away at the realization that this shirt was on somebody. Well, at this point, it was just a skeleton, but he was wearing the shirt, and her tugging had included the weight of his bones. She got over her fear and disgust quickly. Again, it's do or die. And she jerked at the shirt, hoping to have enough force to rip it from the skeleton. She grabbed the garment, wincing with pain, and pulled with as much force as she could muster. She instinctively let go of the shirt right after, from the pain that it caused. But she had successfully torn it free. As she did so, a new nightmare arose. From the cavity of the ribcage, she spotted a ball of snakes. She couldn't tell how many, but there were a large number of different sizes, rattlesnakes that were sleeping, but they had been disturbed and were now slowly waking up. They seemed sluggish, as if they had not clocked her quite yet. It was all closing in on Mattie Ross. Her arm was now so painful that she couldn't even take the shirt to stuff it as a wedge. The moss continued to break free. She heard the slithering of the snakes, who had been rudely awakened from their slumber. "Lord, help me," was all she could say. She painfully grabbed the hand of the skeleton arm, tore it from its socket, and began using it as a flail against the snakes to keep them at bay. It didn't necessarily scare them off. If anything, it confused them for a time, but slowly, there were enough snakes uncoiling from that sleeping ball that she couldn't keep track of all of them. Every swing of the skeleton arm shot pain through Mattie's broken limb. Her position meant she couldn't even see around herself, and she could sense a snake or two slithering behind her where she could not protect. She finally heard noises from the top of the pit. "Help!" she cried. "I'm down here! Hurry up! There are snakes and a skeleton down here!" The voice that called down took any hope she had left out of her. "I reckon there will be another one before spring." The voice of Tom Chaney. How had that man not died? Drops of blood were splattering down around Mattie from Tom's wound up above. "How do you like it?" he taunted. She kept screaming. "You saying you don't like it?" he said evilly. Then something happened that Mattie couldn't see, but she heard a scuffle, and it ended with an awful crunching sound, which she later learned was the butt of Rooster Cogburn's rifle making contact with Tom Chaney's head. Soon after that, the body of Tom Chaney came crashing down the pit, landing on top of the other skeleton. The impact made a dust bomb go off, and Mattie couldn't see anything, but she could hear the rattlers moving faster, many of them sinking their fangs into the new intruder who had landed on top of them. The others were scurrying closer to Mattie. She flailed the bony arm with the little strength she had left, and in her panic, she dropped further. this time down to her armpit. This opened enough of the hole that the bats began to rush out by her face. She now had to use her left arm just to keep her from falling, and she could not defend against any snakes. "Help!" she cried out. "I'm in a bad way! Hurry up!" Rooster yelled that he was throwing down a rope, but she told him she couldn't grab onto a rope and that the snakes were closing in on her. "Hold on!" came another voice. This one was Labib. "Hold on!" Mattie watched as the two adult rattlers lunged at Cheney's face, sinking their fangs into his cheeks and neck, but he did not respond at all. Meanwhile, a small snake had slithered up to Mattie's hand, which was desperately clutching to the rock. Its nose began touching her flesh, as if testing its substance. The tongue flickered, and it rubbed the bottom of its head on her hand. Mattie cringed in anticipation as the inevitable happened. The small rattler plunged its tiny fangs into her hand. When it pulled away, a drop of venom was still dripping from its mouth. She felt numbness almost immediately. The bite itself didn't feel much worse than a horsefly, but in her panicked state, she couldn't remember if it was true that baby snakes were more or less dangerous than adults. Something about they don't know how to regulate their venom concentration, so they're more deadly. At this point, a rope dropped down by her head, and Rooster was descending with a loop around his waist. He landed with a heavy thud next to her and yanked her up by her collar just as her left arm was about to give way to the numbness. He took out his revolver and shot at the closest snakes. The noise sent most of them into a retreat. She now had use of her right arm, but it was in so much pain from being pinned down that it wasn't much good. It was all she could do to wrap her arm around Rooster's neck as he held her, calling to Labif that they were ready. They had tied the rope to the pommel of a horse in order to support Rooster's weight, and slowly, almost surreally slow, Mattie Ross once again saw daylight. But now with a broken arm and an undetermined amount of snake venom in her veins. When she got up, she saw that it was little Blackie that had pulled them up, and Labif was nursing his bleeding head. Rooster was quick to load her on little Blackie along with himself, tying her to the saddle in case she went unconscious. He told Labif that he would send help as soon as he could and to not wander off. Mattie protested, saying, "We can't leave him." "I have to get you to a doctor, little sis," he said. "You are not going to make it." Then he looked at Labif, told him that he was in debt to him for that shot, and then kicked the horse into action. The pain in her arm grew, and she couldn't help but cry. She wasn't sure where they were going. Her guess was Fort Smith, but how many miles away were they from town? Rooster whipped little Blackie to keep him galloping as fast as he could go, and the horse gave all he had, as if he knew the stakes. But as Rooster began to beat the horse harder as it grew tired, Mattie protested, saying he was played out. Cogburn ignored her protests. Eventually, the pony was so tired, it began to slow down, but Rooster didn't have time to let him rest. He took his dirk knife and cut a deep gash across the horse's shoulders. Blackie squalled and took off running again, Mattie screaming at Rooster to stop, but he didn't even look at her. He was a man on a mission. The cut worked for a few more miles, but eventually, Blackie slowed once more. This time, Rooster took salt and rubbed it into the wound, sending the horse leaping forward one more time. But within another few minutes, the valiant pony had nothing left to give and collapsed to the ground, dead. Mattie's heart broke at the loss of her chum. Rooster didn't show any emotion as he ordered Mattie to climb on his back, holding him around his neck. He began to jog. He was not a man fit for running, and his breathing got really bad pretty fast. Mattie fell unconscious, but Rooster gripped her tightly, and when she woke next, he was holding her in his arms. She kept drifting in and out, and one time when she woke, she was in a wagon that Rooster apparently had commandeered off a group of unsuspecting hunters. He just took the wagon at gunpoint. It was deep into the night by the time they reached Fort Smith, and on top of that, it was drizzling, cold, wintry rain. Mattie was knocked out for several days, and by the time she did regain consciousness, she was missing one arm all the way up to the elbow. Her mother and Lawyer Daggett were there. Rooster checked in on her a couple times. There were patches on his face from where the doctor had removed the shotgun pellets. He let her know that the marshals had rescued Labif, but that he had refused to leave until the body of Tom Cheney had been recovered. He got some medical treatment in McAllister's, but had headed straight from there to Texas. Over the next few days, Mattie was taken home by train, and it wasn't for another week until she realized she hadn't paid Rooster the rest of his $100. But still not in a position to travel herself, Lawyer Daggett delivered the money to the man. She wrote the marshal, inviting him to come visit the family farm, and he replied with a short note saying he would try to stop by his next time bringing prisoners to Little Rock. She figured he would probably never take the time to come out there and determined she would visit him when she was healthy enough. Quote, "But I never got the chance to visit him. Not 3 weeks after we had returned from the Winding Stair Mountains, Rooster found himself in trouble over a gun duel he fought in Fort Gibson, Cherokee Nation. He shot and killed Otis Wharton in the duel." Of course, Wharton was a convicted murderer and a fugitive from the gallows, but there was a stir about the manner of the shooting. Rooster shot 2 other men that were with Wharton and killed one of them. They must have been trash or they would not have been in the company of the thug, but they were not wanted by the law at that time, and Rooster was criticized. He had many enemies. Pressure was brought and Rooster made to surrender his federal badge. We knew nothing of it until it was over and Rooster was gone. She kept tabs on him, learning that at one point he took the widow Potter to wife along with all her kids, and they moved to San Antonio where he took a job with the Stockmen's Association. She wrote him a couple times, but there was no answer. But they weren't even returned as undelivered either. She caught news that he had left the widow Potter at one point and headed to Wyoming, where he was hired as a private security of sorts, meant to terrorize cattle thieves on behalf of rich landowners. In 1903, so this is like 25 years after the events of the book, her little brother, now a grown man, sent her a newspaper clipping from a paper in Memphis advertising the Cole Younger and Frank James Wild West show that was coming to town. On the billing, near the bottom in small type, was what caught her attention. Quote, "He rode with Quantrill. He rode for Parker. Scourge of the territorial outlaws and Texas cattle thieves for 25 years, Rooster Cogburn will amaze you with his skill and dash with the 6-shooter and repeater rifle." Her brother had teased her his whole life about how the only man she'd ever loved was Rooster Cogburn. And while it was true that Mattie had never married, now 40 years old, most saw her as a calculated and stern old maid, but she just let little Frank make his jokes. He hadn't been there. He couldn't feel what you feel for a person who did so much to save your life. So she went to Memphis, wondering what it would be like to see the ex-marshal one more time. When she got to the traveling show, she found Cole Younger and Frank James sitting in their shirt sleeves drinking Coca-Colas while fanning themselves. They were old men, but she had to accept that Rooster would be a lot older at this point too. These men had all fought together with Quantrill's raiders and had all had varying levels of outlaw careers. And here they all were in their later years, no families, no estates. They were just a roadside attraction you could bring the family to. They were dinosaurs of a forgotten era. The West was not very wild by the 20th century, and these men had no place in the newly civilized world. Cole Younger stood in her presence. Mr. James stayed seated. She said she was looking for Rooster, and Mr. Younger looked at the ground silently before letting her know Rooster Cogburn had died a few days back in Jonesboro, Arkansas. He'd been sick for months. He'd called it night hoss, whatever it was, but eventually the disorder and the heat were too much for him. He'd been buried in a Confederate cemetery here in Memphis. Younger spoke fondly of him, and Mattie thanked him for his time. As she turned to leave, she looked at the seated Frank James in disgust and said, "Keep your seat, trash," before leaving. With no family to claim him, she paid to have Rooster delivered to Dardanelle on the train, where she had him buried in the family plot. She paid $65 for a marble headstone that was engraved to say, "Reuben Cogburn, 1835 to 1903, a resolute officer of Parker's Court." People of Dardanelle thought this was just some stunt for the cranky old maid to do. No one thought she knew the man enough to go to all that trouble. Quote, "People love to talk. They love to slander you if you have any substance. They say I love nothing but money and the Presbyterian Church, and that is why I never married. They think everybody is dying to get married. It is true that I love my church and my bank. What is wrong with that? I will tell you a secret. Those same people talk mighty nice when they come in to get a crop loan or beg a mortgage extension. I never had the time to get married, but it is nobody's business if I am married or not married. I care nothing for what they say. I would marry an ugly baboon if I wanted to and make him cashier. I never had the time to fool with it. A woman with brains and a frank tongue and one sleeve pinned up and an invalid mother to care for is at some disadvantage, although I will say I could have had 2 or 3 old untidy men around here who had their eyes fastened on my bank. No, thank you. It might surprise you to know their names. I heard nothing more of the Texas officer LaBeef. If he is yet alive and should happen to read these pages, I will be pleased to hear from him. I judge he is in his 70s now, and nearer 80 than 70. I expect some of the starch has gone out of that cowlick. Time just gets away from us. This ends my true account of how I avenged Frank Ross's blood over in the Choctaw Nation when snow was on the ground. Well, giddy up, am I right? I had so much fun doing this book, not because it's a bright and cheery plotline, but a Western was just such a breath of fresh air. I hadn't done one on the show yet, and most of the other Westerns that came to mind are either way too long for me to do in this point in time, like Lonesome Dove, or they're just really dark, like Blood Meridian, and I was not looking to do them right after having done Crime and Punishment. But I also loved it because Portis's writing style is just deceptively simple, and yet he crafted every bit of dialogue meticulously so that it felt appropriate for the time and place. There are two major film adaptations, the 1969 one with John Wayne I mentioned, and a 2010 Coen's brother one starring Jeff Bridges, Matt Damon, Haley Steinfeld, and Josh Brolin. Talk about a stacked cast. Honestly, they both do a solid job of telling the story true to the book and even using a lot of direct dialogue from the book. But because of the overall quality of the actors, I gotta give the edge to 2010. Some of the acting just isn't that good in the 69 version in a way that makes the tone of the movie feel a little more lighthearted, which I'm not saying is a bad thing, but the Jeff Bridges version of Cogburn is more true to the spirit of the book, in my opinion. I think you'll have fun watching either, though. But before we get into the modern day application from this book, just a reminder, give the show 5 stars on Spotify or Apple, or subscribe and like on YouTube, or share your favorite episode with your friends. I appreciate your support. Okay, let's dive in. Now, it's rare that we cover a book where the title itself is a heroic attribute, isn't it? And trust me, I will tie this into the concept of true grit, but we're starting somewhere else. When I started researching about Charles Portis, something was pointed out pretty quickly. You look at a lot of his works, and you'll see that he isn't big on the idea of a shiny hero going out on an adventure. His stories are less, I am a knight who wants to go and save the princess to win her hand, and more, this wolf keeps killing villagers, so I have to go stop it, so others don't die. It reminded me of the Lord of the Rings episodes, which came up multiple times while researching this lesson idea. But in the Fellowship episode, I made the distinction between an ambitious hero and a reluctant hero. Aragorn feels more ambitious, Frodo feels more reluctant. Now I have come up with terms that I think are a bit better suited to the distinction between the two. But instead of these labels being focused on the heroes, they focus on the kinds of quests they go on. So it's world making versus world mending. World making quests are about pushing your limits, seeing if you can level up, achieving things that few have ever done before. It is a desire to leave the tribe, to live the adventure, very traditional hero's journey stuff. World mending quests are about when the status quo of your life has been disrupted against your will, and now you have to fix it if you can. And it's not as simple as just saying one is dangerous and the other is not. This book is very much a world mending quest, and yet it is very dangerous. It comes down more to the motivations of the characters. Mattie Ross does not crave life on the trail, and her desire to see Cheney at the end of the noose isn't because of a bloodlust, but Papa being gone leaves a massive hole in her life's status quo, and the closest thing she can get to her former life is to at least have the justice of knowing that Papa's killer is dead. She doesn't dream of using this as a springboard to a life of adventure. She wants to go home as soon as it's over. This is a world-mending quest, and Portis almost exclusively focused on these types of world-mending stories. The only character who truly fits a more world-making quest, in my opinion, is LaBeef, because he is doing all of this in the search of a massive reward. Because even though Rooster is doing it for money too, there's much more layering to him as a character, but he definitely lands between LaBeef and Mattie on the sliding scale of making versus mending. Mattie is not setting out to do something great. She's setting out because this needs to be done. And she quickly realizes that nobody is going to do it if she's not the driving force. You know, I actually had a listener recently ask if I'd consider including more about metaphors or symbolic aspects of stories. And I had a kind of, oh yeah moment when I realized that I just don't really touch on those. So I've added a component of that to my research to think about metaphors and symbols, but I'm not going to include them unless they are truly interesting to me, because talking about the most direct or surface level metaphors or symbols feels very English class to me, and y'all know my approach to this has never been very similar to what you do in an English class. But that being said, this book did bring up one metaphor that really made me smile. And that's when I made the connection that Mattie just has an accountant's brain. She is literally the bookkeeper for the estate and is very good at accountancy skills, even at 14, like the scenes where she's negotiating deals. But what I hadn't thought about is her approach to justice is also very accountant-minded. She needs Chaney dead not because she is emotionally off-kilter or because she wants to become a bounty hunter, but her strong Protestant background mixed with her accountant's brain means that the killing of her father leaves a debt to be paid. The life of the murderer. She cannot close the account of losing her father until the cost has been recouped. And if you look at the way she describes her mission, it is always very flat and emotionless. It's just a logical need. It's almost like Spock, which I find very interesting. But to finish this setup, if we're talking world making, think chasing greatness, think making a name for yourself, think risking it for the biscuit. World mending is more, I am fixing what is broken, I am righting a wrong, I am trying to prevent future suffering. I feel like it's pretty easy to toss any quest into one of those two, knowing there's definitely going to be a lot of Venn diagramming between these two motivations. But I found a great article that called out how Portis's style subverts the generic hero's journey. It's called The Oddballs and Odysseys of Charles Portis. And what stood out to me from the article is how the author points out that none of his books end with some fairy tale ending that seems to suggest life can be elevated beyond your current status if you achieve something big enough. Put simply, in a Portis novel, when you ride off into the sunset, you then have to make your camp in the dark. Achieving your quest doesn't mean your life won't go on largely the way it did before. You still have to pay bills. You still have to use precious PTO to go to your wife's cousin's wedding. He basically gives you the romance of the following quest without pretending that that removes you from the real world. But the point the article suggests is that we shouldn't evaluate the merit of a quest by our perception of how life-altering it will be to achieve it. Here's a direct quote. Persisting in your quest is meritorious even if, when you achieve it, you have nothing to show for it. Now, I could have taken this whole idea more into the direction of the value of quests that have no tangible rewards, but I was actually drawn to take it one step closer to the origin point of the hero's journey, which is where my second Lord of the Rings thought for this lesson comes into play. It was Sam's speech in The Two Towers, the famous one that got changed into an equally good but very different version for the movie. The speech where he says, "You've always assumed that the greatest stories are of people who sought out adventure, but now he sees that the stories we really care about, the ones we remember, are about the people who didn't ask to be adventurous or brave, but find it being required of them anyway, and they simply keep going." Mattie Ross would have preferred her father come home with the 4 ponies he paid good money for, so she didn't have to ache from being in the saddle all day, sleeping on the hard ground at night. She would have preferred to keep her left arm. Nothing about her story screams, "I wanted this." But she persisted anyway because she needed to do what she could to mend her world. So the real point I want to make today is this. You need to stop thinking of quests as an exclusively ambitious practice. If you're someone who is very happy, making enough money to take care of your family, values your time with your kids or hobbies over anything else, etc., you are not free of a quest-filled life, my friend. The only difference is your quests are likely more often to come from the world-mending bucket. An untimely layoff leaves you financially spiraling. You get a family member diagnosed with cancer, shaking the foundation of your life. A breakup makes you question if you are lovable. The response to these types of modern situations are all quests in their own right. Quests of world mending, trying to make sense, trying to return to a place of security. Just because you don't use the term ambition to describe yourself doesn't mean your life does not present you with quests on the regular. I've been listing catastrophic equivalents, but there are much smaller daily quests that we are presented with as well. And you know what is so interesting about world making versus world mending quests? They require the same attributes to succeed. You choosing it or it being thrust upon you is irrelevant in determining if you have the skills to overcome. Years ago, I found myself trying to answer one question. What is the absolute fewest number of attributes that are required to live what I would call a fulfilling life? I was able to nail it down to 2. Granted, they are very broad ones that can nestle in a lot of other more specific ones, but do you want to know what they are? Curiosity and grit. Yes, I literally chose the word grit 10 years ago when I hadn't even read this book. To me, an intellectually open mind paired with physical resilience is an absolutely lethal combo. I even thought of starting an apparel brand called Grit and Curiosity back then because my creative instincts were firing long before I had this podcast. I just didn't execute on them. But this, friends, is how I turned this broader concept back to this specific story. I don't care if you are the ambition-seeking entrepreneur who wants to make $1 billion company, or the person who feels happiest with the fewest amount of commitments and stress-inducing obligations possible. You will have to deal with quests in your life, world-making or world-mending. And your ability to see the quest through will largely be answered by your ability to face discomfort, both physical and mental. Your success compared to others who give up and just accept the chaos of the world will come down to if you have true grit or not. Such a unique phrase, isn't it? The fact that it is the literal term Mattie is wanting in her man. Remember back when she asked the sheriff who was the best marshal, and he described several to her, but she knew immediately which one she wanted? The one who sounded like they had grit. And I'm sure you noticed this, but the really clever thing Portis did with this premise, sure, Rooster Cogburn is a classic rough and tough cowboy figure, but by the end of the story, the person of true grit that we're most interested in is Mattie Ross. Again, the world mender, not the world maker. LaBeef shows grit as well. It truly is a virtue for all questing heroes, regardless of which bucket you fall under. Now, I know this section has covered a lot of different bases, so let me try to wrap this up in a tight little package for you. Grit is not about your appetite for the difficult. Anyone can say that they want a challenging and rewarding life, but grit is about refusing to exit the story when it becomes painful or uncertain. Because grit is not needed when success feels like an expectation or the finish line is in sight. Grit is mile 20 of the marathon. It's getting the draft of your book back from an editor covered in red ink and just starting the edits on page 1. It's having the patience to help a loved one through their trials, even when it keeps you from chasing your dreams. Grit is what helps you see that your happiest ending is only achieved by pushing through the trials of Acts 2 and 3. Whether you are a world-making hero or a world-mending hero, the two of you can share a knowing smile because you both get the one thing that victims and villains will never comprehend. That the transformation you undergo as a hero in order to achieve your happiest ending requires you to show true grit along the way. And that does it for Charles Portis's atypical revenge plot western, True Grit. Protagonist listeners, I've got a few things to mention, so stick around. But there's one idea in particular that I think is a really cool concept to use, the value of story as a way to strengthen your relationships. Link in description if you want to become a Protagonist listener and support the show in exchange for more content, more episodes. But for the rest of you, for now, thank you for listening. I'm Jameson Olson. This has been Becoming the Main Character, where we evaluate the best stories ever written through the lens of character choices. Tell a friend and come back for the next one. I know I say this all the time, but I am very excited for this next one. And based on the responses I've gotten from similar episodes, I think you will be too. So take care. We'll catch you on the next one.